this module will discuss about the skills and necessary tools needed in order to engage with any trafficking survivors, some cross-cultural aspects on the process of identification and support, cultural differences between helpers and the so-called victims, the persons that are entering in the role of the victim, some assumptions and stereotypes that we might use in our work. Also, the cultural victims, the cultural differences and the barriers to effective support provision in order to reassess our role towards the survivor. So we'll try to introduce today the cultural value spectrum and how we can reframe power dynamics in this provider-survivor relationship. Also, we'll discuss about how to deal with suspected e-trafficking cases during interviews, and about working with interpreters and cultural mediators, some practical tips and suggestions. And also how we'll adapt a trauma-informed approach, how we'll deal with the professionals' emotional responses as well. So let's start by clarifying that this module is not exhaustive and its content should not be taken as the absolute truth. It is more than clear that despite the existing protocols and the procedures, every single intervention of care is different and unique. So the grounds for this statement are simple and derive from the fact that each individual and therefore each case is particular, as we will discuss next. It consists in the background story of the survivor, the context where that story took place, also the survivor's current settings and circumstances, and the survivor's emotional and logical perception and awareness of what has happened. We will discuss in the next slides that sometimes the survivors experience things and their logical perception and awareness of what happened is something that is being gained usually after trying to enter some psychosocial support pathways in order to gain support. So this module is focused relationship. And thirdly, adapting culturally responsive practices when conducting interviews with survivors, also by using appropriate cultural mediators. So, despite the genuine efforts of the helpers, of the service providers, of the care professionals to identify and support the victims, the e-trafficking survivors, cross-cultural differences and perceptions can hinder the effectiveness of service provision. Cultural assumptions and stereotypes can equally affect both the care professional and the survivor, and obviously their fragile relationship. Some examples on this would be, first of all, we might ignore critical information because it doesn't match with our interpretation of the survivor's story. Also, we might misunderstand the statement or misread the situation because we assume that the other person perceives things the same way we do. Also, sometimes we might become offensive and damage trust, even though we have no intention on this. So, stereotyping is usually an unintentional process. We have to admit we all do it, and it is like as if we are on automatic pilot, and it is probably our way to explain or to rationalize the complex and confusing things that are happening around us. Although challenging, leaving the automatic pilot mode is feasible. We may not be able, of course, to erase all of our stereotypes at once, but we can learn to command them and choose how we want to respond to anything different, uh, always in an open-minded and rational manner. In order to achieve that, we can always start by becoming more self-aware on our filters. How do we tend to label people and things around us? We might reach out for information and educational support. Also, another way would be testing ourselves. Every time we make an assumption, we can stop, we can take a minute and think about it. So this is the automatic pilot operation that I just described. So think now, during the day, how often do you catch yourself at it? Do you enter these roles, or do you consider having stereotypes or biases while dealing with the support of trafficking in trafficking survivors? So the complexity of human trafficking networks, along with the diverse barriers unintentionally placed by the care professionals and the survivors, as well as with the existing and long-lasting systemic programmatic gaps, blocks survivors from reaching the support they need. In this slide, we see on the left some care professionals' barriers. First of all, stereotyping, the prevalence of our own values. Communication style might be a barrier from the side of the care professionals. I mean, the slang, idioms, or technical terminology that we might use, pacing, accent, etc. And also, of course, non-verbal communication as well. For example, smiling, eye contact, the gestures we might use, body language, etc. Language barriers also, or expectations of roles of care professionals and survivors, especially in culturally diverse concepts of power and authority. And when I mean expectations, sometimes we ourselves, as we will discuss later on, enter in the role of the savior, but sometimes it's the survivors' expectation to put us on this role in order to support them. And also many times, if they don't have a survivor, a supporting environment, this might be a way of entering this a relationship with us. So on the column on the right, we see some barriers from the survivors' side. So first of all, the fear of the trafficker and threats of retaliation, distrust of the justice system, or distrust of the care system as well, fear of deportation or fear of arrest, loyalty to one's own cultural group, religious groups, ethnic groups, habits, etc. Shame and taboo also can be a barrier. Conceptions of privacy. I would add the role of the family, including on this economic and social pressure that it is placed by the family to the survivor. And of course, last but not least, gender and power dynamics. So in this process, I will try to suggest a way of reassessing our role towards the survivor. I will try to introduce now the cultural value spectrum. So the process of becoming aware of our own cultural values and understanding of how these values become a point of reference and sometimes shape the way we perceive things is critical to my mind. Most often, the way we communicate, we perceive time, we perceive the power and fate is grossly shaped by our culture. Knowing ourselves is, of course, a crucial first step towards the effective cross-cultural communication. But in order for this to be effective, among the key elements are the willingness and effort to understand and also respect of one another's cultural identities, and also norms, beliefs, and ways of communication. So linguistic abilities are of course essential in every type of communication, yet personal awareness of one's verbal and non-verbal communication style and the potential impact that this style might have on the other person is crucial. So we know that where there is violence and exploitation, there are victims and abusers. Both sides equally stick to these roles until either the victim manages to liberate themselves or a rescuer appears. Then is when the slow process of recovery begins. I mean, a transition from victim to survivor and beyond. Nevertheless, when a care professional becomes too attached to the rescuer role, or the opposite, or a survivor too attached to the victim role, this attachment might hinder the recovery process, as you can understand, and unwittingly reproduce also the power dynamics that were present during the actual violent or exploitation acts. Um, so it is also useful sometimes to reflect on how these roles of the rescuer and the survivor replicate, how we reconsider our assumptions on these roles uh, in this process to find some good practices to build and work on these challenges. Um, I will now suggest a way forward on working towards cultural competence support provision. So, culturally competent support provision is among the professional's key commitments towards cultural awareness and respect of the survivor's perception and worldview. Let us go over some useful tools that will help us get there. First of all, identification of cultural patterns. Observe and work within gender norms when appropriate. Reach for cultural knowledge, as we said before. Familiarize with local traditions and practices. Also, avoid stereotypes and treat each case as a unique one. In the second pillar on the right, we see avoid assumptions. So, first of all, confirm the survivor's narrative, the crime that has happened, the consequences. Be open, flexible, and get off the automatic pilot mode. Be aware and control your red lines in this process so that you can reach the third pillar, which is breaking the power dynamics. Number one would be refrain from the savior approach and always reassess your communication with the survivor to ensure that you are working towards their recovery and not their re-victimization. Also, practice cross-cultural communication. I mean, be an active listener, practice effective verbal communication and non-verbal communication, and try to engage in mutual learning processes with colleagues, with cultural mediators, with persons of different professions that work with you in your teams. So as professionals, achieving cultural competence is an ongoing process whose grounds are found, of course, in our own self-awareness and in our commitment to continuously self-reflect on our biases and filters. When support provision takes place with cultural awareness, knowledge, and skills, it is more likely to be effective and eventually assist in the survivor's journey from victimization to recovery.